Good morning. On this blackberry winter day, I guess that's what it is. About that time, blackberries are blooming, so I figured this is it. But glad you're here today. Hope you had a good weekend, and no better place to be than right here today. We'll begin with the opening prayer. Bill Pennington, would you lead us in prayer, please? We're on page 10 on the topic of prejudice. When it comes to that word, it seems like there's a lot of prejudice taking place today, especially within our country. You have individuals who are pretty hostile toward others because of just who they are. It may be a group against this group because of just what the group stands for. And not that anybody's done anything wrong. For some reason, I just don't like who you are. And here they go, one against the other, and because of what they stand for. And the word of today is racism, which is the same thing as being prejudiced. It's racism or discrimination. And whenever this attitude is formed, generally there's no investigation that takes place as to why I'm prejudiced. I just am. I'm supposed to be, I guess, how many people think, and they never investigate what they're prejudiced over or what it's about. So generally it's learned from others. The word, the prejudice is. Generally it may be from one's parents, or it may be from one's peers that are passed down to be this way. And we see a lot of it in our country. Our country is in many ways that way because of the media, and sometimes because of the government trying to, I think, just stir up a hornet's nest just for any reason. And so it's something that has to be dealt with. And yet the Bible says a lot about it and how we are to handle it ourselves. And we don't need to be prejudiced. We don't want to be racist. We don't be discriminatory or anything like that. We want to look upon all individuals as same and love people the way we should. That's because that's the way Christ taught it. There's no better example of this than when Christ chose his 12 disciples, the original 12, because he didn't go out here and choose 12 men from a certain group. He took a full spectrum of who he's going to choose, and they all were different in many ways, and he put them all together in the same pot, and they had to work through their differences. They had to realize there's a greater good here that we got to get in this. We got to be able to love all people, to take the gospel to everyone, and not have this prejudice. And I think that's one reason why Christ chose these 12 men, with all their differences, just to show that it can be worked out. If you have the proper motivation, if you have the proper love for your mankind, then it can work out. He chose some fishermen. He chose a tax collector. He chose a zealot. He chose two sets of brothers in order to make up his disciples. And of course the fishermen, just common laborers, nothing out of the ordinary, just men who work for a living, use their hands. That's fine. You had the tax collector that most of the Jews hated because many of them were dishonest. They were working for the enemy, working for the Romans, and taking money from the Jewish individuals. And well, nobody liked them at all. But he chose a tax collector. He chose a zealot who was a rebel, who was a Jewish individual that was trying to overthrow the Roman government, always causing a stir about something. And well, he chose him there to work with him. And two sets of brothers. You may think, well, they might try to team up on the group. And he did a lot of things, Christ did, And he did this to show that no matter who you are, you can work together if you have the same goal in mind. So 12 men, despite their differences, they had to learn to work together, and they certainly did. And look what they did in changing the world. They did what they could. Now, question 1. Give me a cough drop here. To define prejudice. Was an attitude of hostility directed against an individual or a group or race. So it's just an attitude of hostility. It's all it is. And again, you don't have to look very far today in our country and you see it. It's just everywhere. Number 2, which seem more prejudiced? The rich or the poor, the men or women, old or young, educated or uneducated, rural or urban? Everybody shares in this prejudice. The rich think the poor are prejudiced. The poor think the rich are prejudiced. Men think women are. Women think men are. Old think the young think the old. Educated versus the uneducated. It's everywhere. And it's no one particular group you can say that about. Because, again, everybody, if they say, I'm not a prejudiced person, they may be. They very well may be in some ways, and got to keep it under control. They don't get out. But, there's no one group that's less or more than anybody else. All have it. And therefore, it's just a product of sin, a product of being in a world that we live in that's trying to influence us. And we've got to be on guard against it and not let that happen. As Christians, we simply cannot let that happen. Number 3, how was prejudice demonstrated in ancient times? Genesis 43 and verse 32. Now this is concerning Joseph when his brothers finally all came together. He's second in charge in Egypt. His brothers are there living in the household with him. That's what the setting is here. It says there, so they set him a place by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat food with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. So they're in the house of Joseph. And there's 3 sets of settings. You got Joseph sitting in one table. You got the Hebrews, the brothers at one table, and the other Egyptians are at one table. Three tables. They wouldn't sit together. It's what they wouldn't do. So what Joseph does, he gets up and he serves his brothers. That's unheard of. An Egyptian would by no means serve a Hebrew, an Israelite. And by no means would somebody as powerful as Joseph get up and serve just a common person. So Joseph takes this thought that they have, the Egyptians, that you can't associate with anybody but Egyptians. And what does he do? He breaks that down. And he starts associating with those who are not Egyptians. But the Egyptians, they had those rules that they would not eat with a Hebrew person. They also, you had to marry an Egyptian. You couldn't marry somebody outside your race. You could only socialize with Egyptians. You didn't have any social activity with somebody else outside that of the Egyptians. You could only use a utensil, especially a knife, if it was made by an Egyptian. If you're going to borrow one, you had to borrow it from an Egyptian, because they didn't want a knife to be used to sacrifice, being cut up some odd animal that they didn't like. The Egyptians had their strange thoughts as well. So you borrow a knife from somebody, maybe they had that knife and they cut up a possum with it. You wouldn't use that knife. That's unclean. Stay away from it. They wouldn't do that. You couldn't even borrow a pot from somebody that was not an Egyptian, because they may have cooked some kind of unclean animal in that pot, and that just made the whole thing unclean. So they wouldn't do that. So these Egyptians had a lot of prejudice against others as well. But Joseph here, he shows hospitality to his brothers, and sharing the food with them and offering them to live there with him during their time. So there's something that was done quite opposite what you would think of an Egyptian. Another verse there, Acts 11 and verse 3. Question 3. This is concerning Cornelius, Peter and Cornelius, how they operated. In Acts 11 verse 1, now the apostles and brethren who were in Judea heard that the Gentiles had also received the word of God. And when Peter came to Jerusalem, those of the circumcision continued with him, saying, you men went into uncircumcised men and ate with them. Again, the Jewish individual would not go into the home of somebody that was not a Jewish person. They wouldn't go. They wouldn't eat with them. They wouldn't need food that was prepared by a Gentile person. So here, whenever Cornelius is converted, he becomes a Christian. He's been a Gentile, and this is something just unheard of. It is supposed to happen. But here, whenever Peter saw that vision where all the meats could be eaten, and Peter realized what the Lord was doing here, and Peter came back and reported to those Jewish brethren that the Gentiles are being saved. And they didn't like it at first, but Peter says, hey, this is what's happening. The Lord has given me the command to do this, and they accepted it. At least many of them did. Some didn't, but many of them did. But here is Peter, who at first would not go, but had not been for the Lord working with him in that dream to show him, you are to go, everything's clean now, and he went. So there's how Peter operated. And again, showing that everyone, the gospel is for everyone. Question 4. When some Jews got angry at Jesus' teachings, how did their prejudice show? John 8, verse 48. Then the Jews answered and said to him, do we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? These Jews did not like Jesus. They didn't like his teachings. They didn't like his miracles. They couldn't deny him. He was doing these things. They certainly could not deny what he was doing. And they couldn't deny the truth that he was preaching. So what did they try to do? They tried to destroy his name by saying, well, he's a Samaritan. And he not only says Samaritan, he's got a demon. So they went out here and chose a name, the lowest race you could have, and then give him a demon on top of that, just trying to show their prejudice. And it's prejudice against the Samaritan people as well. And and they did this just trying to bring him down. They couldn't deny what he was doing. They just hated him. So here, let's give him a name. Let's put this name on him. And a little more on that. That happens today quite a bit. Whenever you hear somebody call somebody a name, and they're trying to degrade them, it's because what the person is saying is true, and they can't counter that. They know truth will stand on its own. So since they can't really deny that what the person is saying is truth, I'm just going to call them some kind of name, derogatory name or something like that. I'll call them ugly, or they got big ears or big nose, and or all this. Here they go talking about the person's features instead of trying to defend their position. And whenever you hear that, individuals start to degrade a person. It's because generally what they're saying is the truth, and they can't oppose it. So let's just try to tear the person down. So be aware of that and how that works too. Question 5. Are words, phrases, and expressions of hate and prejudice ever justified? Ephesians 4:29 and Colossians 3:8 here. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. And Colossians 3:8, now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. So the answer is there, no, they're never justified. It falls right in the category with all these other things here: anger and wrath and malice, and blasphemy. You don't want those words to come out of your mouth. Stay away from them. So prejudice will fall under the corrupt and filthy language part here. Don't need them. Well, yeah, he hates evil. Mm-hmm. Yeah, God is prejudiced against evil. Good point. Certainly is. And we should be too. Question 6. How do we obtain our prejudice? John 4:7-9. This is a woman at the well, and Christ met her. A woman of Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then a woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" For the Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans. Well, to answer the question, how does it happen? It just gets passed down from one generation to the other. Parents teach the children, children teach their children, here it goes. And at some point, hopefully, the individuals learn enough of what's right, and they don't do this. And that's what Christ did time after time. The Samaritans that everybody looked down upon, he built them up. The Samaritan people. He would call them out. Look at the good that the individual's doing. Look what this person did. The parable of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan, that one Samaritan man was the last one you'd think that would help, but he did. When those 10 lepers were cleansed of their leprosy, and one came back, the only one that came back, guess what he was? He was a Samaritan. And Christ brought that out. And here's this woman, not supposed to talk to a woman, period, but a Samaritan woman, and Christ is doing that. Christ is trying to get rid of all the prejudice and of his time and teaching us as well, because we're all made in the image of God, all of us, and we're all equal in God's eyes. He loves us all. Question 7, how can we get rid of prejudice? Acts 10:34, and it says, Then Peter opened his mouth and said, In truth I perceive that God shows no partiality. If we're going to try to follow the ways of God, he's not partial. He's not partial. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. The sun shines as well. God's grace, salvation is open for all. Other verses that show this, they're not in the book, but 1 Peter 1:17. If you call on the Father, who without partiality judge according to each one's work. So God's not partial. Romans 2:11, for there is no partiality with God. So we follow the example that Christ has given to not do this. Don't show that partiality, prejudice. Question 8, I'm not sure about what he's meaning here. Is all prejudice bad? I don't know where he's coming from, 1 Corinthians 13, where it talks there about love. I'm not sure unless he's meaning, I don't know what that verse is for. What's your thoughts about it? 1 Corinthians 13, all about love. Is all prejudice bad? Of course, we would say, yes, from a human standpoint. What Robert said, God has prejudice towards evil. That would be true. But why that verse, I don't know. 1 Corinthians 13. And that's where he's coming from on it. Mm-hmm. I couldn't find anything prejudiced in 1 Corinthians 13. But it works against it. It'll take care of it. Mm-hmm. Right. Practice 1 Corinthians 13 and you won't have prejudice. You won't have it. Question 9. Describe how prejudice can hurt its possessor. Well, the first one, there's an atheist. Acts 17:32. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, while others said, we will hear you again on this matter. They had a preconceived idea about this, and they weren't going to be open to the truth. These individuals who mocked what the apostles were saying here. A preconceived idea. Again, resurrection. Who can be resurrected? That was their idea about it. So there's an atheist. He comes in with a preconceived idea. B is a religious world in Matthew 13. Verse 15, for the hearts of the people have grown dull, the ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes will they see, and your ears will they hear. In the religious world, you have a lot of complacency. I don't have a need to read the scriptures, anything about that. I know what I know. I've always been taught this, and they don't want to investigate any more truth about it. They want to investigate maybe what you have to say concerning the truth. So in the religious world, there's a lot of complacency about it. And there can be some in the church as well. We can't have that. We always got to have want to know more knowledge of truth. And C, what about the Christian? Galatians 2:13. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with me, so that even Barnabas was carried away with hypocrisy. Again, this is about Peter, of all people, Peter, who was a hypocrite. Because he was the one that taught Cornelius. And yet, at some point, he went back to his old ways of thinking that the Gentiles cannot be saved. He went back to that way of thinking. And Paul's calling him out here. You can't do this, Peter. You can't have this way. It's not right. And Peter, I'm sure he changed about it. And even Barnabas, he got caught up in this. So here we have Peter, an apostle, who got off track a little bit and began to have some prejudice. Number 10, what price did Nathanael almost pay for his prejudice? John 1:46. And Nathanael said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip said to him, come and see. So just because someone was from Nazareth, Nathanael said, can't believe them. No use even talking to them. They're no good. Nothing good at all about them. Of course, that's where Christ came from. And whenever Philip told him about Jesus, It was hard for him to believe. But little did Nathaniel know that there's some pretty important people in the Bible who came from Nazareth. Anybody want to take a stab at who they were in the Old Testament? Jonah was one. He came from Nazareth. Another would be Elijah, the great prophet. He came from Nazareth. Another prophet, Nahum, came from Nazareth. So because of Nathanael's ignorance of not knowing everything, he just assumes anybody that comes from this area, well, they're just stupid. You can't trust them. They don't know anything. But he was wrong. And like question B there, 10b, Philip, here he says, come and see. Philip was already, he was convinced. Yeah, he's from Nazareth, but he's different from anyone else you may think about. He was convinced that Christ was good. So again, we don't want to have the attitude of Nathaniel. We want to have the attitude of Philip. And let's do our work. Come and see, as he did. Then the questions at the bottom. Number one, is prejudice a natural human emotion and God-given? It certainly is an emotion. I'm not going to say it's God-given. It can't be that. But it certainly is an emotion. It's a learned response. You take small children, little children, they don't have a problem with it. And somewhere as they grow, they learn it. Again, not good, but they learn it. Number two, what are some of the motivations that make up prejudice? You might have a bad experience with someone, and you might be a little bit prejudiced against that person, possibly. Maybe the way that we look at ourselves, we might see ourselves a little bit better than someone else, a little bit prejudiced. I'm a little better at this or that than you are. No reason. Maybe out of fear to please somebody else, I'm trying to make an impression over. He's prejudiced, so I'm going to be a little prejudiced, trying to impress this person. Maybe my boss or somebody. Might be a neighbor. Again, there are reasons why we do this, or why people do it. So, and number one, how can one tell if he's prejudiced or not? Well, you've got to examine yourself. Am I making an assumption about someone or something without the facts? What are the facts? What am I backing it up with? Just because of the person's color, nationality, education, economic status, is that why I'm making it? Again, we can't do that. Those will not work. Anything on prejudice? Yeah. Sure enough, love your neighbor as yourself. Who's my neighbor, Lynn? There you go. Right. All right, 10:30. We'll take up the next topic next week.